Well, thank you all for coming. So I'm going to be talking about the Arctic Ocean, and specifically I'm going to be talking about a couple things related to loss of sea ice. Now, it shouldn't be a surprise to anybody in this room that the Arctic Ocean is an area dominated by ice. In fact, it is what makes the Arctic the Arctic. Without the Arctic, it's a completely different system, completely different animals living there, completely different lifestyles. And because it's got ice, it's got a unique characteristic that things have evolved to live in. The ice extent varies on a seasonal time scale. We've got minimum ice in September, maximum ice sometime in March. But this has been changing in recent years, as Eric alluded to. This is a plot of changes in sea ice in the wintertime between 1870 and not quite the present, but pretty close to the present. You can see for most of the time series, up till about 1950, that sea ice in the Arctic was pretty constant. And then starting in 1950, we've had this precipitous decline that's only accelerating as time goes on. This is the extent of the ice. And if we look specific years, this again now is sea ice extent between February and June. And what it shows is the gray areas at the top are basically kind of average sea ice years, what you would see. 2012 saw the lowest sea ice ever in September. And we don't go all the way to September, but you can see it's the record low. 2017, the year we're in now, is setting the record. It's already set the record for the lowest amount of ice in the winter, and it's already the lowest sea ice in the spring. We don't know yet what's going to happen in the summer, but it's a very low ice year. Now, sea ice extent is very important. We've lost 50% of the ice cover in the summertime already, but the extent of the sea ice isn't the only thing. Even more dramatic has been the loss of sea ice volume. And by sea ice volume, I mean how extensive it is and how thick it is. And what's happened in the Arctic in the last 30 years as the ice has gotten a lot thinner. And so what this shows, this is an animation showing this ice age. So the whiter areas are old, thick ice. The areas that are a little more on the gray side are younger, thin ice. And this I'm going to show an animation. It's going to start in 1984, and it's going to go up until 2016. And what I want you to look at is see, there we go. So I got to stand here. What you can see is that there's a lot of thick ice in the Arctic early in the time series, in the early 1980s. What you can also see is that some of the ice is being flushed out of the Arctic, particularly over on the eastern side of Greenland. There's a big mass of ice in the middle, sort of right above Canada there. You can see it sort of swirling around. But it's been relatively persistent for a long time. All of a sudden now what we're seeing is that more and more of that ice is starting to disappear. The thick ice is being replaced by much thinner ice, and you can see that happening. You can see it being flushed out, and as the time series goes on, what you can see is that more and more of that thick ice is actually melting. And you can see really clearly in 2004, we lost a bunch in 2004, in 2005. 2007 is going to be a really dramatic loss of the thick ice. Right there, we lost a huge amount of thick ice. In 2008, 2009, you can see there's very little white left compared to what there was at the beginning. 2011, very little left. There, just lost another big mass of ice. Some is still being flushed out, but more and more recently what we're having is the melting of that thicker ice. And so if you can compare this to what it started looking like, where it was almost completely white. The Arctic was over 40% thick old ice. Now there's very little thick old ice left in the Arctic. And in fact, the Arctic has lost over 75% of the volume of ice has disappeared in the last 30 years. And that is a big loss of ice. Oops. There we go. Now, why is this happening? Eric alluded to some of the reasons. And as I said, one of them is there's been atmospheric circulation patterns that are moving that ice out of the Arctic. That was sort of the beginning of the time series that I showed you. But more and more recently, what we're seeing is that warm waters are coming into the Arctic, melting the ice, and the Arctic temperatures are also increasing, melting the ice. You put all those together, and what you end up with is something called the ice albedo feedback. And that's what's pictured here. What you see is at the top, under normal circumstances, what you've got is sunlight comes in, A lot of that sunlight bounces off the ice, that radiation goes back out to space, and the Arctic stays pretty cool. As you start losing some of that ice, though, the ocean absorbs light really well. The ice reflects it really well, but the ocean absorbs it. And as you start losing ice, you start heating up the ocean. The ocean heats up, it makes it harder to form ice the next year. You end up with less ice, and you end up with a positive feedback that ends up happening, where eventually what you do is you lose all the ice. This is what it looks like as we're in this phase now. We're in the ice albedo feedback phase, where it's just the loss of ice is accelerating as that ice is disappearing. I'm a biologist. Ice isn't my primary interest. What I'm really interested in is the productivity of the ocean. So what I would really like to know is, given the fact that all this ice is disappearing from the Arctic, how is that affecting the ecosystems there? And what I study myself is the base of the ecosystem. It's these guys here. These are called diatoms. They're tiny little plants. They're photosynthetic, and they're important because they consume a lot of the CO2 that we produce. They produce a lot of the oxygen that we breathe, but they are the food for basically everything that lives in the Arctic. Ultimately derives its food from these guys. So it's really important to know what's happening to plankton in the Arctic under these changing ice conditions. It's a hard thing to tell, though. The Arctic is a really difficult place to sample. It's hard to go there. It's expensive. You can't go very far. And so what we try to do is use other tools. And the tools that I tend to use are satellites. And so we can look at the Arctic much more easily by satellite than we can on a cruise ship, although we do go on the cruise ships. And what we can do is we can get snapshots of different things of the Arctic basically every single day. We can see how warm it is, sea surface temperature. We can look at how much of those plants are there every single day. That's what that chlorophyll is. We can put that information together, combine it with an algorithm, and we can estimate how productive, how much food is being produced by the Arctic every day and every year. And when we do that, we can look and see how have things changed. And this is from 1998 to 2012. This is a change in productivity in the Arctic. And what you can see, obviously, is there's been a dramatic increase in the productivity. In fact, the productivity of the Arctic Ocean has increased 40% in 15 years. 40% in 15 years is huge. For an entire ocean basin to have increased that big over that short amount of time it's hard to fathom. Why is this happening? It's happening because of the big thaw that we talk about. We've lost all this ice. We lose the ice. What we do is we increase habitat for these particular organisms. So the Arctic is becoming much more productive. But by doing that, it's becoming much less Arctic. And so the system is changing. This is what's happening in open water, because we can measure this with satellites. But there's other things going on in the Arctic as well. And that is what's happening under the ice cover. And so we were on a cruise in 2010 and 2011 in the Chukchi and the Beaufort Sea on this ship here. And what I'm going to show you is this is an animation, and you're going to be sort of real-time oceanographers here. What it's going to do, it's going to zoom in onto the study area, and you're going to see what we saw during this particular cruise. And I'll describe it as it goes. You're going to get a bird's eye view of what the ocean looks like if you were something swimming in it, for example. So there's our ship. It's hard. Hopefully you can see that better, because I see a big white glare here. What we're going to do is we're going to drop below the ocean. You can see that we're in open water here. We're heading toward the ice. And hopefully you can see it there. So we're sampling the water, and we're measuring how much plankton is in the water. And eventually what's going to happen is this is going to turn colors. Purple colors mean there's very few plankton, and so you see a lot of purple in open water. We're headed toward the ice now. We're in the ice, and suddenly the purples start to turn green and red. Green and red mean there's lots of plankton. We are under 1 meter of ice at this point. We're under 1 meter of ice. You see that area of red there? That area of red is 30 meters thick. So we've got an area of 30 meters thick of basically pea soup plankton underneath a meter of sea ice. This is where we sort of headed off into deeper waters. We turned around, we saw that, we just said, we got to sample that again. So we went back and we sampled it again. There, we found that big phytoplankton bloom again. Again, a big 30-meter thick layer of nothing but algae. And this we're still under the ice, you can see. We start heading into open water again, and we start seeing a lot more purple. When I was on this cruise, if somebody would have asked me if this was possible, I would have said, there's absolutely no way. There's no way you could have that much phytoplankton under that thick of ice. We've never seen it. My experience from the Antarctic says it can't happen, but it happened. It happened here in the Arctic, and we've seen it at least 3 other years now, this same phenomenon, that the phytoplankton, they're not just blooming in open water, they're blooming under the ice. And this is what it looks like when you're actually there. That's on the right. On the left side is what you would normally expect to see under the ice, nice blue water. This is what we saw when we were there on the right. Pea soup green. You couldn't even see the bottom of the ice. The visibility was maybe 1 or 2 meters, is as far as you could see. It was so thick. To put that into perspective of how much this was compared to what a global average would be, this is what we basically did was look at how much phytoplankton were in that water. If you just looked at from top to bottom and you added all the phytoplankton up, how much is it? On the far right, what we see is what the global mean would be. So this is if we looked at phytoplankton everywhere in the world, the productive regions, unproductive regions, every place. The global mean is about 46, and that's milligrams per meter squared. The units don't really make that much difference, but it's about 46. The average we saw in that bloom under the ice, 1 meter thick, was 840. The maximum was almost 1,300. This is the largest phytoplankton bloom ever measured in the world, ever, anywhere. That blue dot there was the previous high, and our maximum surpassed it. And so the question is, how can that possibly be? How can you have this much phytoplankton growth under the ice in the Arctic when the waters are -2 degrees? The reason is because the Arctic is not the new Arctic is not the old Arctic. This is the old Arctic. The old Arctic in the spring would look like this. You'd have lots of old ice, lots of ridged ice, relatively thick ice. Very little light is getting through this ice to the water column below. So those phytoplankton are not growing underneath this ice. This is what the Arctic looks like now, most of the time, most places in the springtime. What we see is this is 100% ice cover, but it's all covered in meltwater. It's melt ponds. This situation, you transmit, lots of light goes through this ice to those phytoplankton below. So this is a recipe for early phytoplankton blooms in the Arctic. So what does this all mean? First thing is the Arctic is losing ice at an alarming rate, which is really important for the animals that require ice to live. It's becoming much less polar. It's going to become something more like a temperate or subpolar region very soon. The productivity is increasing, and you can determine whether you think that's a good thing or a bad thing, but it's a different thing. It's going to be a different Arctic than it's been historically. It's increasing in the ice-free ocean, and now it's increasing in the ice-covered ocean as well. We don't know what the ecological impacts of this is going to be. It's too soon. It's happened too recently. We just don't know. And this is the one that worries me the most. Because ice is melting earlier, because now phytoplankton blooms aren't even waiting for the ice to melt anymore. They're blooming when there's still ice there. The timing of the blooms are changing by as much as a month. There's lots of animals that live in the Arctic that require the Arctic to be productive at a particular time of year. They've evolved to migrate to the Arctic, to be there when the productivity is at its peak. If productivity shifts a month earlier, those organisms may be in big trouble. And so this is what worries me. It's not that the Arctic is being more productive, it's that the timing is shifting a lot. And so with that, I will end my story and I will turn it over to Michelle.
All right. Well, thank you. So to carry on from what Kevin was talking about, I'm just gonna move us from what I consider the